Okay, so picture this. You're walking through an art gallery, right? And the paintings on the walls, they're not just pretty pictures. They're like reading the front page, the headlines, the big stories of the day. That's kind of what it was like in Victorian Britain. And that's what we're going to dive into today, how art actually became like this tool, this powerful tool to push for change in society.
Yeah, and for those of you listening who, like to get to the heart of things, quickly get the knowledge without all the extra stuff, you're in for a treat today. We're going to uncover some really surprising connections.
That's right. So we're talking about a time when artists, they didn't just see their canvases as, a place to make pretty things. They saw them as like this platform to speak out about, all the tough stuff going on in their world. And it's interesting because so many of the issues they were tackling back then, like pandemics, right, public health inequalities, it's like we're still fighting those same battles today.
Absolutely. It's uncanny how those themes resonate through time. And speaking of connections, what kind of sources are we looking at to really understand this whole artist activism thing?
Well, we've got a great book called Art for Reform and Social Change in Victorian Britain, which goes right to the heart of it, how artists were actively trying to make a difference with their work.
Right, to the source. And to give us a broader perspective, we're also going to be weaving in ideas from other areas like literature from the Renaissance through the Romantic period and how we interpret those works. And of course, we can't forget the huge social and economic changes that were happening in Victorian England. It's like all of these different puzzle pieces coming together.
So we're on a mission here, right? We want to understand how these Victorian artists were trying to, sway public opinion, get those important conversations going, and ultimately influence the direction society was headed in. And we'll be looking at actual examples of their artwork, the strategies they used, and get this, we'll even find some parallels with how art and media are being used to make an impact today. Kind of blows your mind, right?
It really does. And to kick things off, I think a great starting point is an observation made by the art critic John Ruskin back in 1875. He was looking at the Royal Academy exhibition, and he said it was like looking at the pages of an illustrated newspaper because so many of the paintings were depicting, scenes from everyday life, especially the struggles of ordinary people.
That's wild. So it was like art was holding up a mirror to society, reflecting back all its triumphs and its troubles.
Exactly. And one artist who really embodied this idea of the artist as a reporter was Luke Fildes.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of him. Wasn't he actually a news illustrator before he became a famous painter?
He was, and that background really shines through in his work. One painting that comes to mind is Applicants for Admission to a Casual Ward from 1874.
Yeah, that one's pretty intense. It's based on one of his earlier sketches, right from when he was out there documenting London street life.
Exactly. He takes that gritty realism from his news illustrations and brings into this powerful canvas. What you see is this long line of people waiting to get a ticket to a casual ward, which was basically a shelter for the homeless.
Oh, wow. So he wasn't shying away from the harsh reality of poverty at all.
Not at all. He shows the exhaustion, the desperation, the sheer poverty of these individuals. And it's a world away from those, sentimentalized or romanticized images of the poor that you sometimes see in art. And what's interesting about that? It's that by not sugarcoating it, Fildes forces the viewer, those comfortable middle and upper-class Victorians, to confront the reality head-on. It's a tactic you still see today, like in documentary filmmaking, that really gets under your skin.
Makes you think, for sure. So how did people back then react to this very raw portrayal of poverty?
It was a mixed bag. Some critics found it deeply disturbing, even painful to look at. They thought it was ugly in its depiction of suffering. But then you had others who saw it as a call to action. They felt like it forced you to acknowledge just how bad poverty was and to demand change.
It's amazing how art can have that power, right, to provoke such strong emotions and to mobilize people to do something about it.
It really is. Now, while Fildes used realism to make his point, other artists took different approaches. Thomas Kennington, for instance, he often used idealization to create empathy in the viewer.
So instead of hitting you over the head with the hard truth, he was trying to touch your heart and make you care.
Exactly. And a great example of this is his painting The Pinch of Poverty from 1891. It shows this young flower seller, just a child, really trying to support her family by selling these daffodils.
Oh, that pulls at your heartstrings for sure.
Right. And while you can see that they're struggling, their clothes are worn, their situation is precarious, Kennington still paints them in a very appealing and sympathetic light. He's not trying to shock you with the ugliness of poverty, but to gently evoke a sense of compassion.
It's like he's saying, look at these people. They're just like you and me. They deserve our help.
And the way he positions the flower seller is really clever. She's almost reaching out towards the viewer, offering her flowers. It's like a direct appeal to the viewer to do something, to buy a flower and make a small difference in this family's life. It's subtle, but powerful.
It's like he's putting the responsibility on the viewer to act.
Exactly. And that's a theme we see again and again in Victorian art, this idea that everyone has a role to play in solving social problems. It's not just the government's job or the charity's job, it's everyone's job.
So whether it was through shocking realism or heartfelt idealization, these artists were all ultimately trying to get people to pay attention and to care about the issues that mattered. You mentioned earlier that Victorian artists were also grappling with the issue of pandemic, something we can definitely relate to today.
Oh, absolutely. They were living through some pretty scary times with outbreaks of cholera and other diseases, and their art reflects that concern, just like we see today with artists responding to COVID-19.
So how did they approach this theme of disease and public health in their work?
Well, one really interesting example is a painting by W.A. Atkinson called The First Public Drinking Fountain from 1859. It's almost like a public service announcement on Kansas, created in response to London's cholera epidemic.
Cholera was a huge problem back then, wasn't it?
It was terrifying. It spread through contaminated water and millions of people died. And one of the key breakthroughs in fighting cholera was understanding how it was transmitted, the link between dirty water and the disease. And that's where Atkinson's painting comes in.
So it's like he's educating people through art.
Precisely, the painting celebrates the opening of London's first public drinking fountain in Holborn, a source of clean, safe water. And what's really striking is how Atkinson shows people from all walks of life, all different social classes, using the fountain together.
It's like this symbol of unity in the face of a common enemy, right?
Exactly, and by showing everyone drinking from the same fountain, he's subtly conveying this message that beating cholera requires everyone to have access to clean water, that public health is a shared responsibility that transcends class divisions. It's a really powerful image of collective action.
So it's clear that these Victorian artists weren't just painting pretty pictures. They were actively engaged with the big issues of their time. And to really understand the context in which they were working, we also need to look at the political and social changes that were happening in Victorian Britain.
Absolutely, there was a lot going on politically and socially, and one source that gives us some great insights into this is a Frieze lecture on the world of Charles Dickens. It talks about all the major reforms that were underway, like the expansion of voting rights, the changes to the poor law system, and attempts to regulate child labor, although the lecture points out that these reforms weren't always perfect and sometimes had unintended consequences.
It's like 2 steps forward, 1 step back sometimes.
Exactly, and of course we can't forget about the abolition of slavery in the British Empire and the passage of the Reform Act of 1832, huge milestones that shifted the balance of power. And then there's the Industrial Revolution, which completely transformed British society.
Yeah, the Industrial Revolution was a game changer in so many ways.
Absolutely, the lecture talked about how new technologies like the steam engine led to a boom in industrial production in mining, iron, cotton manufacturing. And of course, the railways and all this led to massive organization as people flocked to the cities for work. The middle and working classes grew rapidly.
But I imagine all this progress didn't benefit everyone equally.
You're right, there was a lot of debate even back then about whether the Industrial Revolution was making life better or worse for people. Some argue that living conditions for many, especially in the early days, were terrible, but others point to evidence that wages eventually rose for many workers later in the Victorian period. It's a complex picture, and the lecture also highlights how social commentary, like the novels of Charles Dickens, played a vital role in reflecting these dramatic changes and prompting debate about their impact. And if we think about the literary trends that came before the Victorian era, like Romanticism, which emphasized emotion and social satire, we can see how Victorian artists built upon that tradition, but shifted their focus to a more direct and often realist portrayal of societal problems, much like Dickens did in his writing.
So in this time of huge change and upheaval, it makes sense that art would become more than just something pretty to look at. It became a tool for social change.
Absolutely, and Chloe Ward, the curator of the exhibition Art in Action, Making Change in Victorian Britain, says that art during this period was really seen as a powerful political tool. There was this belief that art could actually shape public opinion and influence the future.
And speaking of that exhibition, I remember there's a way for people to check it out even if they can't physically visit.
That's right, the physical exhibition may be closed, but the Watts Gallery has a fantastic online video tour led by the curator herself. It's a great way to see many of the artworks we've been talking about and to learn more about the exhibition's themes.
Awesome. So this whole conversation has really highlighted how Victorian artists use their art to grapple with the big social issues of their day, kind of like how we use different forms of media today to address the issues that we're facing. And it makes you think, what are some examples of art or media today that are trying to raise awareness or inspire action? You know, it's this ongoing tradition of using creativity to try and make the world a better place. And hearing about those strong reactions to Fildus's work makes me think about how some types of social commentary in the media today can also be really polarizing. Don't you see some parallels there?
Totally. I think the methods and the platforms change with the times, with technology and shifts in culture, but that fundamental human urge to use creative expression, to engage with society and try to shape its direction, that seems to be a constant throughout history.
It's like we're all connected through this desire to use our voices and our creativity to make a difference.
Absolutely. So to wrap things up today, it's clear that Victorian art wasn't just about aesthetics. It was a force for social change, a way for artists to spark debate, inspire action, and advocate for a better world. And they tackled a huge range of issues, from the realities of poverty to public health crises.
And they did it in so many different ways, some using stark realism to shock viewers, others using idealization to evoke compassion. It really makes you wonder, how are artists and creators today using different styles and emotional appeals to influence how we think about social issues?
It's a great question to ponder as you encounter different works of art and media in your daily life. Think about the techniques they're using, the emotions they're trying to evoke, and the impact they're trying to have. That's the real legacy of these Victorian artists. They showed us that art can be more than just beautiful. It can be a catalyst for change.
And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder that question and to explore the world of art and activism with fresh eyes. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive today.
It was a pleasure to explore this fascinating topic with you.